Thank you. I hope you guys can hear me and see me. I'm not able to see the rest of the panelists. Let me just shift to gallery view. Oh yeah, good. We've got a lot of our folks here. Okay, I think we've got a full house. Is anybody missing, Ria, that we're still waiting for, or we're here?
We're waiting for Dewi, Kartika. She had joined in, but we seem to have lost her again.
Okay, very good. So hopefully she'll join, but I won't hold us back. We'll keep moving. Thank you to the panelists who I can see, and thank you to all of you in the audience who I can't see. So yeah. So I hope the opening session was exciting, and most of you were able to join from the beginning, and also that you enjoyed the music, both from Push, who have, by the way, I saw Push after I think 25 years on the video screen today. So it's great to see some of the old faces that we've not come across for a very long time. And the music was great, Push, if you're listening. Thank you for that. So so this session really is on a topic which is bothering many of us today, the whole issue of leadership and what role leadership can play. And obviously, if you think of the world that we are facing today, there are many things which come to mind. And I suspect for this audience, the people who've joined this call, I think the issue of massive inequality, the issue of the growth of elected authoritarians, because authoritarianism is not new to the world, but the whole issue of elected authoritarians who have a newfound legitimacy in the way they behave is a new phenomenon. We have Islamophobia, which is deepened certainly in our part of the world, but I think in many other parts of the world. We have the huge climate challenge which we are facing. So some of these are things which we've been struggling with now for some time. And now in the last just 2-3 months, I mean, we have the COVID pandemic, and obviously everybody would agree that all the fault lines that we are talking about have surfaced so much more clearly through the COVID pandemic. It's exacerbated everything that the people on this call are concerned about. And of course, the whole issue of racism, because we've not new again, but we've seen how the murder of George Floyd certainly has kind of shown us this whole structural, systemic issue of racism in the world. And in my head, these are all so interlinked. Every single one of these issues are so interlinked. I mean, it looks like they're all different pieces, but if you can put it together in your head, complicated as it may be, they're all interlinked. So, and of course, the question then is, what is driving all of this to happen? And there are multiple factors. It's not like there's one thing. But I always look at these pictures of the G20 conferences, these big summits which happen with global leaders, and you look at that table and you look at the people around the table. So that's our mainstream global leadership, right? So that's Trump, of course. Then you have Xi Jinping. Then you have Erdogan. You have Modi. I mean, just look at just looking around the table, you kind of Bolsonaro, Putin, and to some extent you don't need to think so much. I mean, I suppose with Ian, I should also bring in our dear friend Boris Johnson. So, I mean, just look around the table and then you're thinking that, okay, actually, we don't need to think that hard as to why we're in such a bad shape. We just have, historically, we've kind of reached a juncture when we have the most bizarre set of people running the world. So we've always had strange people running the world, but I don't think we've ever seen this kind of a combination of people. So today's discussion is about ethical leadership and, how we can deal with this issue. And not just talk about leadership in kind of the mainstream way, but also in terms of social movements and the counter to what the mainstream is showing us. So my request to the panelists has been to kind of touch on at least 2 or 3 things during the conversation, but they'll of course approach it in the way that they will. But I was requesting them to look at this question of the huge disappointment that particularly young people have with the mainstream political and corporate business sort of leadership. I'm sure many of you would follow the Edelman Trust Barometer surveys. I mean, we keep having trust levels in mainstream leadership going down and down year after year. So that's the first point of discussion. The second is, what does this mean for leadership of social movements? What are the issues, the challenges, the opportunities? Increasingly, we are seeing, and I'm sure that Gustav and others will talk about this whole idea of leaderless movements. What does that mean? How do you have collective leadership? I know that Kejal is really talking about that whole issue of doing things in a very consensual way, a much more distributed form of leadership. So really challenging the old style of this 56-inch kind of leadership which we have to deal with in many countries now. I think Tony is dealing with that in the Philippines, with we have leaders who are larger than life, macho, masculine. So this is a kind of, and how do you challenge that with an alternative way of thinking of leadership? And of course, then the final question is about can you, how do you build this for the future? It's one thing about what it is today, but thinking ahead, if you want to sustain movement, sustain action and impact, how do you create the kind of leadership? And can it even be created in this digital kind of age? Because in the old style, we used to think that we should build leadership, and now it seems like leaders are just thrown up. I mean, if you look at all the big social movements, the mass movements, those people are not known to us. They've just emerged from nowhere. They've been thrown up by circumstances. So we're in a kind of a moment of churning. So I don't want to take too much airtime. We have an amazing panel of speakers with us, and so I want to go straight into it. I just want to tell the audience just how we're planning to structure the next couple of hours. It's great to have 2 hours. By the way, these Zoom calls, which I'm sure you're all on, get over before we know it. So this is good that we have a bit more time. We also have more speakers, so in that sense, it kind of evens out. But we have a powerful group of speakers, and so just in terms of structuring the next 2 hours, my request to the speakers has been to keep their welcome, Dewi. Good to see that she's joined. Welcome. We can see you, Dewi. Hello, hi. So we have the kind of proposed sequence is to kind of keep the best for last. So not to say that the first few speakers are not as good, but it gets progressively better. And so hold on to your seat belts and put it on, and don't leave till the very end. But so Ramesh ji, I was going to ask him to kind of open, because he's got the historical context of the work of Jai Jagadekta Parishad. So I thought let him open and frame it. Then we'll go straight to Indonesia and Dewi. So that's the second speaker, Gustav, who's got a great historical perspective on where all of this is coming from. We'll hear from Gustav. Then Kejal, I think that's roughly when we'll get to a halfway point. And so we're proposing a short break at that time. Short break in the sense that we will have a slideshow from the work that Ekta Parishad has been doing on COVID. But like, if you guys want to, we won't ask you what you're going to do, but if you want to go and do whatever you want for 5 minutes, please go do that as well and come back. And then we come back, and when we come back, we have Ian from Extinction Rebellion. We have Tony from the land rights movement in the Philippines and beyond. We have Maji, who's fascinating, from Kaduna in Africa, who will come in at that point as well. And then we have Liz, who is from the Poor People's Campaign. We have unfortunately, just because it's kind of some weird hour in the US, she sent us a video, so we'll hear a video. And in terms of your ability to kind of interact, and we want to keep this as interactive as possible, so please use all the channels to ask your questions. Ria is pulling the questions together for us at the back end, and she's going to keep sending it to me. So I'm hoping that whether it's on the chat or wherever, please send your questions. And we'll try and get the questions in as we go along. So after each speaker finishes, I'm hoping to kind of channel some questions to them, so we don't kind of accumulate all the questions and all of you go to sleep while we are talking. So we'll just keep it as interactive as possible. And I'm also welcoming the panelists to jump in and ask questions to the other speakers. So we're not going to use a very kind of structured format in that sense. Please jump in. Let's make it as interactive as possible. So that's my piece, really. I think we should jump in, right? Are you folks ready? The panelists are all set? Excellent. So, Ria, anything else that you or any of the organizers want to say before we jump in, or should I just give it straight to Ramesh ji?
Hi, I would just like to say that since each speaker we're giving around 7 at the 7th minute mark, I will ring a bell. That would be like a timer for all of you. Yeah. Thank you.
That's good. She's bringing some order into our rebellious movements, but you can try, Ria. Okay, very good. Let's go, Ramesh, please.
Yeah. So thank you, Salilji, and thanks to organizer for giving me this opportunity to discuss some of our own experiences from the ground. I requested Salil that I would prefer to focus on the grassroots leadership building processes and some of our success or limitations in the past few years. Being a Gandhian organization, we have a very strong belief that the whole building leadership is a process of transforming from self to society. The process of leadership building is a lifelong journey of transforming self to society. What Gandhi always advocated, that the means are more important than the change itself. The means for leadership building in the nonviolent movement for us are truth, stillness, and renunciation. We call this behavioral transformation, a core value of leadership in the Gandhian movement. So in Ekta Parishad, how actually we start the whole process of grassroots leadership building, I would like to share a few thoughts on that. We actually begin with a 3 days leadership camp. I would prefer to say is a camp for realization of our own individual and collective strength, which is instrumental to motivate the grassroots leadership with a strong belief in the non-violence. Over last 2 decades, we got success to build a grassroots leadership of 20,000 plus cadres who are spread over thousands of villages in different parts of India. These 3 days camp is necessarily focused on three strong fundamental pillars of non-violence. The first day, we spent time to talk about the understanding, to build the understanding, and also to build our own understanding for stand against the structural violence, what we call sangharsh. That means a struggle. So the whole of the first day, it's a kind of a individual stories, a group stories, the group work, as well as kind of a concluding statement about our own understanding and standing against the structural injustice. The second day, we actually spent to gauge the space of dialogue. That's extremely important in the whole Gandhian way of leadership building process. We call it samvad. That means engaging your opponent in a constructive dialogue process. And the third day, which again, it's very, very important day, the day when we together configure the collective action and reaction according to our strength and according to our own context. We call the day of Rachna and the constructive work. So these 3 days are actually very, very important for people who actually participate in this kind of leadership camp. Normally, in the range of 80 to 100 people from village. We do organize this kind of leadership training in the village itself, and that actually helps us to build the process, the leadership from bottom up. After building this leadership, the second aspect for us today, it's extremely important, what we call a shift, a move from culture of silence to culture of resistance. And being a Gandhian organization, we have a very strong belief in posing the moral questions. So the first part of our thinking and our strategic action is posing a moral question to the society. I mean, we know that we have a real big middle class society, and sometime and most of the time they are disconnected with the large sum of issues related with the poverty, injustice, inequality, and violence. So in our campaign, it's important to reach out to those people and transform the passive supporters to the active supporters. And what Gandhi said is a very important. If you are not indifferent, the world will be different. So we have our strong belief, and we had several cases during the Janadesh, during the Jan Satyagraha, during Jan Andolan or Jai Jagat, how we get success to mobilize a large number of middle class people to come and to support our cause and our campaign. But the second thing, it's also extremely important here, is posing a moral question to the state, to the political system. I remember the incidents of 2007 when we took 5,000 people under the leadership of Rajgopalji. We walked all the way from Gwalior to Delhi for a month. Imagine 25,000 people when we reached Delhi, and until then there was no political reaction. So a day before entering to Delhi, we decided to give a slogan, and that slogan was a really like a game changer slogan. And the slogan was give land or jail. So it's, for us, it's a moral question. The question which we have actually presented to the government of India, and believe us, within 24 hours, a lot of things have been changed in our campaign as well as in terms of their responses. So sometime posing these moral questions to the society and to the political system, we have our own some interesting stories and successes. Now, the second part is building leadership that also means a shaping and shaking the democracy. And what Salilji said in his opening remarks, I mean, we are now witnessing the leadership which is largely against the society itself. So, how to build the whole democratic understanding within the movement and within the leadership? It's a very, very important component for us here. That means a deepening of culture of democracy, a building ownership and responsibilities in the processes, respect the plural voices and innovative ideas. That's a part of our whole campaign building and leadership building process. And I again remember the very interesting story of Janades 2007, when you know that walking and doing demonstration in the national highway for a month with 25,000 people, no one can imagine. You can easily arrest, you can easily face a lot of offenses lodged by the state, etc. So there was one innovative idea came from a village leader, and he said that, Rajaji, I have a one suggestion. Can we write a postcard, one postcard? Each and every foot marchers write a postcard to a prime minister, and the message was so simple. Dear Mr. Prime Minister, even after 65 years of independence, you'll never get a chance to visit my village. So I'm walking and I'm coming to meet you. And believe me, this simple postcard, 25,000 postcards sent to the Prime Minister's office, and that actually resolved the entire question of legal and political setup. So there was no complaint against us. In fact, the police and local administration, they were very supportive as to allow us to walk in the national highway and give the safe passage to reach out to the Delhi. So sometime, if we build the whole culture of democracy, that means we also allow the different voices to come up with their own ideas and imagination. Another aspect for us in the whole democratic building process is a proportional sharing in and for solutions. So the building alternatives and balancing the power. So we keep saying be a part of solution and not just to amplify the problems. The written agreement which Ekta Parishad has done over years with the state government and central government, and that actually resulted in a land reforms process for a large number of poor on the ground, actually showed some shared ownership processes in the readdressal mechanism. So here for us it's important not just to be a part of problem, but to be a part of solution too. The third part of the whole leadership building process for us is a configuring a spectrum of responses. And we know with our own experience that the political responses is it's not the everything actually we want. So visioning the movement as well as the milestones. When I say the milestones, that means the turning point of the social movement, turning point, or you can say the halting point of the movement. The social movements, what we learn with our own experiences, need to be ended with a positive note and energy, which ultimately helpful to rebuild the social action with more energies and imagination. I mean, we keep say we keep talking about in our organization that the good leaders of social movements have to be visionary about the landing and takeoff process. So most of the time, I mean, who are the good pilots who know the good takeoff as well as the good learning? If we know only the good takeoff and we don't know how to land, where to land, when to land, then it's a problem for the movement. So the whole leadership building process for us here, it's a part of this whole understanding of the larger context of visioning the movement as well as the milestones, turning points and halting points, I can say. But the next part is also very, very important. The political responses are the only one segment of overall social mobilization. the building a strength of rainbow coalition here, it's important for us. I remember the processes in 2007 and 12 when we talked with the railway union. I mean, what is necessary to talk with the railway union when you are doing a one grassroots action and working for the land rights? So it's important because most of these people who are the part of this journey, they have to travel by train and come to this the place called Gwalior or Delhi. So that's why this is important. Now, the last part of my presentation, it's all about the talking, the one of the toughest part of leadership building process in the conflict zone. I can name the two areas, the buster, which actually I called as a open landmine for the social movement, because many social movement, they lost their ground. This is the place for the international audience, the 40,000 square kilometer area, which is known as one of the biggest conflict zone of India, sacrifices life of 15,000 people over the last 2 decades, a brutal fight between the state and the other organized forces. So in the whole of Buster, when Ekta Parishad started to work in the 80s, that was a very successful mission. But in the mid-90s, when the whole organized forces came, we were actually pushed. And not only we, a lot of social movement, they were pushed out of the Buster. And now we are only focusing in the area what we call North Buster. So this is definitely the case where we're still struggling to build some kind of a grassroots leadership. But the second case of Assam, it's a very interesting case where the whole turning of aggression into reconciliation and reconstruction process. I remember 10 years back when Rajgopal, myself, and some of our colleagues, we started the process of peace building and leadership camp in the Assam, how we get success to engage some of those underground leaders in the peace building processes. And we get also success to encourage them to participate in the political process. And these political processes are very, very important for us. And I'm very happy to say here that some of those leaders who are the part of our leadership building process as well as the peace processes, now they are holding a position in the parliament, they are holding the position in the assemblies, they are also holding a position in their development councils. So I must say that the social movement has to be a kind of a one political alternate vision at the end. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you. We cannot give you about 1 or 2 minutes extra because you are, after all, our kind of host and organizer of the show. So you get some special treatment. I kind of didn't even bother to introduce Ramesh. I should have probably done that at the beginning. But for those of you who don't know who he is, he's the national coordinator of Ekta Parishad, but also been a key driver of the Jai Jagat process, and has been very well known in the land rights work and the kind of food, land, all of the forest issues. I mean, all the issues which Ekta Parishad is best known for. And I've had the privilege of reconnecting with Ekta Parishad after a long time since I've come back to India. So Ramesh and I have spent some time talking about all sorts of strange things in strange places and villages in the middle of the night in the last year. So thank you, Ramesh. And I think, to me, that combination that Ekta Parishad and your experience of the people power, the grassroots level people power, but bringing in the kind of the Gandhian moral, ethical kind of a dose of that, but at the same time engaging systematically with the state and with power is a brilliant combination which Ekta Parishad has been uniquely able to do. And some of it is linked to your own leadership, with Rajaji and you and others. So it comes back to the leadership question as well. So as far as I can see, there's no questions, at least that have come to me so far, Ria. So to Ramesh's presentation. So I'll press on. I'll see if the panel wants to ask or say anything to what Ramesh said. Otherwise, I'm going to bring in Dewi. I don't see any action yet. Everyone's a bit shy at the beginning, of course. After some time, it will become complete pell-mell and chaos. But good to see some order at the beginning. So Dewi, again, if you're from the kind of world of agrarian reform, if you are familiar with what happens in Southeast Asia or Indonesia, she is a very well-known face and a well-known figure. But for those of you who are not familiar with that part of the world and that space of agrarian reform, land rights, maybe you don't know her, but she heads KPA, which is she's the Secretary General of KPA. She has, and it's so good to see a woman leading this after many Secretary Generals. You have Dewi now, who's running the show, and it's a very powerful movement of land rights activists, agrarian reform activists. So, Devi, please, it's your turn now. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Salil Shetty. I hope I pronounce your name well. Thank you. Greetings from Jakarta, Indonesia, everyone. It is my honor to be here, to be part of these discussions. My salute to all leaders and friends, teams in Ekta Parisat for making this momentum for us to meet, and my salute for the long walk of Jai Jagat who keep inspiring us from Indonesia here. So I hope I can speak in my own language, so I can speak freely without thinking too much to speak out, but I will try my best. Because this is a global discussions level, I want to take this opportunity to say that at this time, after the last 5 months of having a corona pandemic, I feel that I'm in the feeling of big doubt on global international governmental organizations, because I see that after we being hit by the pandemic, each country have to do by their own. So there are so many multiple crises that having going on in, I'm sure, in many countries in Asia, in Africa, in everywhere, how to deal with these multiple crises, because before the pandemic we have the hard situations and pandemic making many worse. But we feel that there is no concrete uh, global solidarity in terms of how to facing the economic inequalities and justice because of the political bureaucracy globally or regionally. So that's my first thought to start the discussions. But from our experience, because my organizations is movement organizations who fight for land rights, we call as agrarian reform movement. Our organizations is built from the beginning. Our foundations is because there's hundreds of land conflict situations in our country. So that's the why this movement is become a consensus at that time in 1994, that we believe that we need like to unite in a big organizations to put peasants group, indigenous group, fisher folk groups, and many organizations who believe that we need agrarian justice in terms of uh, small peasants and landless have their own constitutional rights to get land from the state. So that's the basic foundations why my organization is being built at that time. So when we're talking about how to maintain the peace situations in building the social movement, it's quite challenged. There is no clear formula how to keep uh, uh, demanding of justice can be in line with the peace situations in our country. So until now, after the colonializations and until now, the situation is still not really in favor for the people in the ground. Still many discriminations, criminalizations, land grabbing, many peasants and indigenous being excluded from their territory, from their livelihood, from their village. So it's a challenge how to maintain the peace situations. So our organization is growing from the confrontations type movement in the beginning to be more like mix between confrontations model and then become a collaborations or in cooperations with the government, with the state, for fighting the social justice in terms of land rights, equal rights to land for the landless people and the peasants. So I think it's a challenge, but building a movement is like a building a big house. In my experience, because I've been more than 10 years with KPA and learning a lot from our failures and from our successness. So it takes a lot of time and energy to build it and to learn how to make the best of it. And it's like building a house need a lot of material, not only like thousands of brick. We need like balancements and sands to bound all the bricks, and need thousands of commitment and consensus. Because when in terms of agrarian reform movement in Indonesia, uh, the the main group in our constituency organization is the peasants groups, the majority group. But then with the time, uh, there is a belief also from the indigenous group that agrarian reform also should be there for them. So it's become uh, I cannot say as a rainbow coalitions, but it takes a lot of time to have one consensus between the big group, between the peasants and indigenous, how to be in the same spirit of agrarian reform. So that's, I think, the challenge on how to build a national consensus for agrarian reform movement. And it takes a same spirit and same value, same integrity, and same interest also, because to have one solidarity. And because of the movement is begun with the hundreds of land conflict, so it takes a challenge also to have a one one consensus on the strategy how to build this movement. And we learn a lot from the lessons in the past, and also like in the present time. But from me, to build a social movement, to build a solid social movement, it should be our principles should still in line with the people in the ground. So for me, yeah, movement can movement should come from below to keep us still connecting with the ground, because our organizations is national based organization who have many grassroots members. So the challenge is how to still connecting our agenda in the national, in the provincial level until the ground. I think uh, that's the essential of building a solid social movement, and we need like to strong and solid alliance also to build the very long-term social movement. I think that's from me. Thank you very much. Maybe we will talk more to elaborate my perspective. Thank you.
Devi, can I ask you? I mean, because Jokowi is a little bit of a mystery to people outside, because you have a kind of a populist mayor of Jakarta who comes in with a lot of expectation from people like us outside, saying, okay, I mean, finally we have somebody who's not from the kind of your mafia of 20 families who are part of the industrial military complex. He's an outsider. He's a man of the masses, and he will support progressive causes and human rights. And then he's like doing this tightrope walk and dance. And so, how does that affect social movements and the leadership question that we are discussing today? Can you kind of give us a little bit more context as to this regime, which seems a kind of patchwork of coalition of parties and interests? How does that affect your work, and how does it impact on today's discussion?
Yeah, Jokowi governance gave a lot lesson for social movement, especially for agrarian movement, because after the 10 years of the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono regimes before the Jokowi, we tried we put our hope that agrarian reform will be a national priority, for him, and he put that promises to us. So, but we believe that even though like uh, popular leaderships in the beginning, still there will be influence by many political interests and also investor interests. So I think for the social movement, like agrarian reform movement in Indonesia, is I think it should be to have not just to just confront this regime, this governance, but also how to come back to the from the spirit of the below, because what we believe now is should be connected with what peasants and indigenous that we present to this government. So I think now our positions is we need to figure out what will be the best strategy to confront the government who have the promises, even strong promises. We already have national president's regulations on agrarian reform after 25 years of our struggle. But I think the challenge still there, big challenge, because now even there's so many law and regulations that not in favor for the landless and the peasants. So it's like paradox of policy also. In one side there is a pro policy on agrarian reform to recognize people's right, but in the same time they keep producing the law and regulations that keep discriminate and violates our rights. So that's
one of the questions, Devi, that's come from the audience is that, and this is probably relevant for Tony and Ekta Parishad as well, to the extent that, work on land reforms and peasants, etc., is a very rural question. And the urban mobilization, particularly of youth, is really what catches the world's attention, because, people in some villages mobilizing where there's no media, etc., is one thing. But so how do you balance, how do you, kind of make sure that you have impact in urban spaces where you have media and media attention? So that was kind of one angle, that question that came. And the second one, which kind of partly is for Rameshji as well, how do you sustain youth leadership? Like we have high rates of dropout, people coming and going. How do you keep that interest sustained? And I guess it's relevant for all the panelists, but let me just give it back to Devi to finish off from her side.
Yeah, I think agrarian reform in our context is not really like partial movement with the urban groups. We believe that the situations that facing by the rural communities also will impact the situations in the urban. There are so many villagers, there's so many women from the rural community being excluded from their farming activity because the land has been grabbed by the investor and by the state. So now there's so many workers that come from the village who work in the cities. So that's why agrarian reform movement in our context is always connected with the labor movement. So that's why when we commemorate our National Peasants Day, there will be always labor group who join the National Peasants Day, including when the labor commemorate the May Day, we always join, and even the labor movement also demanding agrarian reform agenda. So that's how the strategy, how we connect with many alliance and many movement, not just like peasants movement, indigenous movement, but also with the labor movement in the urban area. And talking about the and also you mentioned about mass media, because in the past, agrarian reform or land reform in Indonesia always affiliated with communist issue. So it's also a big job and a challenge, but there is also progressive situations when national media began to interest with this agenda. Before that, they always connected, oh, this is communist uh, trying to asking the land from the state, because in the past. But now mass media is begun to open with this issue, and they trying to connect with us. So I think that's a good progress compared to in the past situations. And you're talking about regenerations. Yes, I think like the other movement, we facing regenerations, crisis of regenerations. We we see that the senior leaders in the movement is for us is for me is still important to have to make a guidance for us. Uh, but we believe that strong young leaders in our movement, in especially in agrarian reform movement, it should be come from the long process of caderizations, like long-term educations, training, leadership training, ideology transfer from the senior leader to the young generations to transfer the value, the same principle, and to have the same objective. Why until now we still demanding for the genuine agrarian reform? I hope that's answer.
That's great. I mean, I will come back to this, I'm sure, as we have other speakers. I'm also very curious to see how, Kejal and Ian, who kind of come from the new kind of movement world, would relate to, this kind of long process of cadreization and, that old style of Ekta Parishad and Tony, and, we did it over 30 years and we will change the world, to this guys who just show up, and then they're changing the world as we're watching it. So that'll be very interesting feedback to get. Ramesh, do you want to say anything before I take it to Gustav on the question of sustaining leadership and dropout rates and things like that?
Salilji, very briefly, I don't want to eat the time of the other speakers, but very, very briefly, just two comments. The one, it's all about the urban attention, how we actually keep the urban attention also in the social movements. I know that. I mean, the whole process of urbanization, it's no more. It's a process of urban-centric development approach, because the way urbanization is happening throughout the country is actually grabbing the land from the village itself. So this is the interface where we have such a very interesting examples like special economic zone, the protest against the special economic zone. That was not just a rural, that was urban too, because the people who were promised earlier to get employment or some job after the special economic zone, they never get any job. So that was the one perfect example how this interface is actually building naturally. Regarding the whole retaining of the young leadership process, we have many avenues for that. I mean, of course, the Ekta Parishad is largely known as a rural movement, as you said rightly. But we have also a very interesting space for the young people who are coming from the urban spaces. What Rajaji said, that the whole process of rural-urban is one example when young people from the cities, they participate in the processes and some work in the rural areas also. The very recent one, the whole COVID relief operation, was a one perfect example, because most of us, we were locked down in some or other places. So the people who work in the really on the ground, they were the people who are like a self-imposed leaders. They came voluntarily in the forefront, and then they decided to come and to support. So I think these are some very recent example out of this whole question of retaining youth leadership.
Very good. Thank you. Gustav, I want to bring you in now, and I just want to, by way of introduction, I think most of us who are kind of in the social movement world know of him, kind of a very interesting mix of an engineer and an economist and an architect. And so, and he has been kind of one of the key architects of the World Social Forum. He's an International Council member. ATTAC was probably, what Extinction Rebellion is showing to us today, ATTAC showed us some time ago, in a different way. And while, of course, you can say there are new movements and old movements, I don't think we would have had the new movements if we didn't have the old ones. So I think it's great to have that perspective of, where it's coming from and where we've reached today. So, I think it'll be also good to hear from you, because you will bring in. So, I mean, by the way, Gustav's CV will take about 15 minutes to read. I'm not even bothering to talk about his time at Cred or everything else that he's done. But I think the interesting thing is that he'll give us a good conceptual frame, I think, to think about what we're discussing today. So over to you, Gustav.
Thank you very much, Salil. I am very honored to be here. So these are some reflections. The question of the leadership of social movements is a political one. This question of leadership meets the question of nonviolence. It is not a discussion on nonviolence as a moral principle, but on the role of nonviolence in the strategy of the movements, its effectiveness, and what it reveals. Movement leadership differs according to the culture of the historical emancipation movements. Leaderships emerge in coalitions and fronts between the movements. Among the long historical movements are the peasant struggles and the struggles of the working classes. The decolonization movement, with the transition from the first phase of the state's independence to the current phase of people's liberation. The movement of freedoms and rights, with a new sequence since the 1960s. Each one creates its conception of leadership. Considerable movements on a global scale characterize a new period and are creating their conception. It is the women's rights movement that challenged millenary relationship, the indigenous peoples movement, and today the movements against racism and racist police violence. These movements refer to the proposal of intersectionality, articulating classes, genders, origins. Other movements is becoming crucial, the ecological movement for climate urgency and biodiversity. We will focus on new movements that have developed since 2011. In 2019, there were massive demonstrations in 47 countries. This new generation of movements with a new culture renews a vision of leadership. Depending on the specific situation, they have similar keywords. With variation depending on the situation, they present themselves as anti-authoritarian and horizontal movements. They are described as leaderless. Even if leaders or spokespersons appear during the movement, in reality, none of them control the movement. By their form of organization and their use of digital technology, these are movements in the digital era, even when this characteristic is not enough to define them. The strategic perspective of this new generation of movement is one of social, ecological, democratic, and geopolitical transformation. The leadership needed is one that is able to articulate resistance and alternative in each of the 4 dimensions and in the articulation between the dimensions. Social movements are confronted with oppression and counter-revolution, and with the rise of racist, security, and xenophobic ideologies. Leadership begins with the organization of social, democratic, political, ideological, geopolitical resistance. But even to resist, alternatives are needed. Leadership is based on the capacity to propose a perspective on possible futures and on immediate alternative actions to build the future in the present world. The culture of movements is strongly characterized by the digital. In mobilization, digital tools and street demonstration reflect the same reality. They create a common protest culture that spreads rapidly and in which millions of people can participate. Connected protest movements assume collective identities that transcend the usual political and social division. Part of the leadership will come down to the ability to mobilize young people engaged in the digital world. Social movements are confronted with the question of their forms of organization. In the governance of the leaderless, digital tools facilitate work and a more horizontal and egalitarian organization of tasks, as well as real-time communication. The idea of functioning without formal organization, without leaders, without important infrastructure originates since the 1960s. It favors an ad hoc form of organization with those who present themselves and who want to participate. The lack of decision-making structure, however, leads to what Zeynep Tufekci calls a tactical paralysis. Lack of leadership limits the ability to negotiate at the right time. No one can engage a movement towards new tactics. It facilitates the erection of de facto leadership that attract attention but are not formally recognized and are under heavy public attack on social networks. The will to politically define the modality of organization is not secondary. The questioning of delegation and representation makes it difficult to define legitimacy. Leaderless movements have not designed spokespersons, no elected or institutional leader, but they are also less vulnerable to being decapitated by arrest, cooptation, or corruption. They have experimenting new forms of political leadership. This is a critical re-examination of the function of leadership. In the political culture, since the first international, the leadership of the movements was provided by the political parties. Social movements directly assumed some of the organization tasks that were traditionally under the responsibility of political parties, such as recognized leadership and negotiation. The questioning of the party form is much more fundamental. It is linked to the questioning of the formally dominant strategy of social transformation. Creating a party, conquer state, change society. Since the 1960s, the movement demanded their autonomy and refused subordination to political parties. This was expressed in world social forums around horizontality and diversity, and has been extended by the generation of movements after 2011. The search for a new synthesis, or at least a better articulation between the movement form and the party form, is on the agenda. What is at stake is the definition of a new strategy for political transformation. The most difficult challenge for the movement is the redefinition of democracy. It is on this dimension that progress is essential. Representative democracy is under question. It is perhaps necessary but not sufficient. The debate is also open today in relation to democracy on the actuality of the forms of populism that propose to build the unity of movements and our nation around charismatic personalities. Movements are confronted with the battle of cultural hegemony. The leadership of the movement is challenged by this situation. Revolts become revolution when outcomes appear possible. If inequalities, discrimination, and injustice have become unbearable and unacceptable, it is also because a world without inequalities, discrimination, and injustice appears possible. Jai Jagat.
Gustav, thank you first of all for sending your presentation in advance. I must say that your last paragraph in your note, which you just spoke about, was too complex for me to understand. If you could just kind of unpack that a little bit, I think it'd be helpful, because it seemed like you were saying something very powerful, but I couldn't really, get my head around it. Maybe with an example, if you could explain what you were trying to say, the last point you made.
That means that the revolt is the first step. And the revolt is a very long period. And there is some moments in history which lead from revolt to revolution. It is when another world appears as possible. And what we have seen with the pandemic period is that for people, the question of a world without discrimination, without injustice, without inequality could be possible. And this gives a new kind form of revolt. That's why I say it is the kind of the hegemonic battle.
That's very good. I want to see if Tony or Ian or any of you want to kind of come in and ask anything to Gustav. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you, Gustav, is that so the World Social Forum was kind of in a sense ahead of its time, because you talked about intersectionality. There was a question from the audience saying, what about the movement for the rights of disabled persons? So you, World Social Forum, presented a platform, an opportunity for, it doesn't matter what your cause is, as long as it's progressive and it's kind of, focused on democracy and rights, come and let's share this together. But if you look at all the most successful movements, or maybe we shouldn't be calling them movements, maybe we should be calling them campaigns, they are always very sharply focused. They have a single purpose, a very clear goal. They're very time bound. So how do you balance these two? I mean, do campaigns coming together lead to a movement, or these are two different animals?
Oh, you see, in fact, in the world social movement, the world social movement is the third phases of altermondialism, alterglobalism. The first phases of alterglobalism was the answer to the neoliberalism, the first phases of neoliberalism. And so the first phases of alterglobalism was about against the debt, against structural adjustment programs. It was from 1979 to 1989. After 1989, it was a new period. It was the period of the fall of the Soviet Empire. And on these phases, for neoliberalism, the question was to have a new international institutional world. And the answer of the world of the alterglobalism was in the slogan, the international right was not to be subordinated to the right of affairs. And we begin the World Social Forum in the third phases. It was in after 1999, after the Seattle campaign. And then was a new step, and a very important new step. And this new step was until 2008 and the financial crisis. And from this time, we had the emergency of the new movements. And the question now is a question to build a new phases of world social, not of world social forum, of alterglobalism against neoliberalism. So it is campaigns, of course, but these campaigns are in a specific situation of the world presently.
Very good, thank you. Ian or Tony, do you want to come in before I pass it on to Kejal? Anything from what Gustav said? Anything that strikes you, you want to ask him, or you want to kind of get off your chest? Okay, Tony, anything from your side that you want to bring in now? You have to unmute. Yeah, good. That's good. Go.
No.
We are very, very well-behaved panel. Thank you very much. Okay, Kejal, we bring you into the call. Thank you, Gustav, for your comments, and so that's very helpful. I think it was good to have a kind of historical overview and a kind of conceptual conversation as much as a tactical one, which some of our conversation should be tactical. So Kejal is kind of it's interesting. So I was saying, if you look at the Blue Ribbon movement, which Kejal is a key part of in the context of India, it's certainly something which is new and emerging and becoming kind of interesting. Also kind of started with an urban setting from Bombay, which is one of our big cities, as you know, and then and kind of also evolving all the time. So I think Kejal is going to give us, particularly, I hope, a kind of a youth perspective and the angle of, what does collective decision making mean? Because at the end of the day, you also have to move, and if you spend all your time trying to create consensus, how do you get results, right? So do take us through that, Kejal.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Salil. I'm really happy and humbled to be part of this panel. I think a lot of experience and wisdom there here. I'm happy to bring in a little perspective from the youth side. I'll just request the team to also share the presentation I've shared with them. Right, thanks. Can you take it to the present mode? So I thought it will be nice to also use some pictures and just also keep it a little bit specific and go to the next slide. I wanted to start with first acknowledging this entire part that today where we are here on the efforts of so many of these movements, so many of the on-ground work that's gone. Something Salil also touched upon a little earlier, that we're standing on a lot of work and wisdom. But from there to now, and we really acknowledge and we deeply value this. Because a lot of times it comes across that young people are probably not valuing it and they feel they know it better and all of that. So I think I wanted to start with that we respect the ancient wisdom, experience, and from there on, we want to build upon it. We want to take it forward. I think the question of how do you build leadership for future? And this leadership is not just because young people should be leading, but because these ancient values, wisdom are important to be taken ahead. And to take them ahead, probably they need to be taken ahead in a little different approach, which makes it more relevant to the changing times and are able to also respond to the newer questions. So I think that's what the first part of how do we kind of move ahead from here and what is the new thing that will take us ahead from here. Can we go to the next slide? So alongside when we're going forward, I think before we move ahead, it's also important to understand what's happening with this generation. Like when we say young people, who are these young people we are talking about? Because the different spaces have different definitions of ages and years and say, okay, people who are probably under 40, under 30, under 35, under whatever. So I think it's important to unpack who are these young people we are talking about, what's the age group, and from there, what are their needs specifically? Are we understanding what these young people need? And across generations of young people, if we probably look at somebody who was in the 1920s and look at what was the need of a young person there, and specifically in India, if I have to look at, it was about getting freedom. It was just about getting the freedom, and hence going out on the street was just a very and the most obvious thing to do because we wanted our country to be free. But over the generations, as we move forward, the needs of these us as young people have changed and have evolved, and it's important to kind of contextualize and understand what these needs are, why have these aspirations changed, and are we being relevant to them? And I feel the first and important part is there's this disconnect because our decision makers and key stakeholders who are deciding for all of us are really elder people who were born in a different era when social media, internet were not present, when these were just probably getting thought about to kind of bring a different kind of scenario to us. So they were still probably conceptual stages, and a lot of things have changed with these things. The life has become quite fast paced. The way we look at our needs, aspirations have moved. And Maslow's hierarchy, I think, here is a very important tool which all of us might have seen at different stage that we have as humans. We have different set of needs, and I feel our generation specifically has been quite lucky in that way that we were born to parents who were more or less able to at least provide basic necessities required, may it be safety, may it be food. And this, I'm not talking just from an urban context, but also in rural parts of India, at least like basic food of a day for a day or so is more or less now becoming possible. So now when we are born in such times, and most of us are also have at least a basic phone that we're able to kind of connect to different kinds of people. It's bringing to us a very different set of possibilities and a very different set of next level needs. And I think this picture I found very interesting when I was looking up. It's put up a lot of social media icons around and how social media is influencing these. And I think what it specifically also brings to us is this need of esteem and belonging, which is very high, which each of us is seeking right now. And hence, when we talk about what are the problems young people are facing, a lot of our problems are around this area of around mental health issues, knowing what we want to do, how do we connect to, how do we contribute to the world, how can we make this world a better place. So I think a lot of our needs are coming from that space. And I think the third and the important point I want to make here, that being instrumentalized to do things. I think across my experience of being starting from volunteering during college days to last some years of being in social world, NGO spaces, movement spaces, I think one thing which is very common is young people are remembered when there are some things to be done. Okay, you have to go and probably get a venue ready. Okay, you have to go and probably get some logistics set up. This whole thing of young people being invited or being thought of when things are need to be done, I think that kind of restricts the amount of growth that's possible if young people are also part of discussions, conversations when they're being thought of. They'll also be equally up to pace and up to speed with the ideals we're talking about, the different ways of why a certain movement or a certain social initiative is thinking in a certain manner. If I am part of that conversation from early days, I am able to relate to it better. I think the reason I'm able to share this today is because I could be part of these conversations very early on. And that's what has made me bring up to speed to so many other things. So I think this whole part of being present and being part of understanding. Sure, when I was in those initial conversations, I might not have had the thoughts, but I had curiosity and questions and a lot of learnings which I could get from people who were present. So I think it's very important to not just instrumentalize young people for different causes and say, okay, let's fight for this cause, let's get young people, and they'll be talking about the cause. Sure, they should be talking, that's their responsibility, yes. But I think alongside what's also important is investing in these young people. We'll go ahead. The next slide, I think I want to also bring forward to from this, what are we saying and what are these spaces which will enable youth leadership? What are the things are we talking about? And an important part of this is sharing power, bringing young people to the decision making table to be able to share, to hear a different view, to understand. Probably just answer their question because that's how they're learning and trying to get in the values and ideals that we've been holding when we started some of our work. Second is investing time in grooming these leaders at all tiers, not just your second line, but third line, fourth line, and all tiers and of all diversity. When we talk about different diversities being represented, it's also about hand holding these different diversities, may it be women, may it be underrepresented sections. All these things will require some investment of time and resources. They will just not happen. And for that, at times, it may need us to kind of be a little more patient. It may require us to go a little slow and not immediately talk about just getting the work done, but also how are we getting this work done. The means is an important part of this process to build this leadership in different ways. And I think the third point is how do we have intergenerational dialogue spaces and learning spaces? Because it's only when this happens together is when we are able to create something. And I just want to go forward to the next slide by presenting an example of how we've been able to look at some of these concepts and ideas in BRM's case study itself. We were particularly an NGO doing programs, reaching out to young people through a civic leadership program, getting them to do local civic action with the municipal corporation and training them in leadership skills. But over the years, we realized social change is a long-term journey. It's not just about doing the program. The program is just the beginning. And if they have to sustain with us for a longer time, sustain just doing social change work with anybody for a long time, it's important to be connected over a journey. And that's when we realize we need to work more with our alumni because that's how a movement will be formed. And then the movement will continue and the movement can take up any cause which the young person feels resonating to. And I think that started with this first part of how do we change our leadership models. The people who are leading, they letting go the power and believing in us, saying that yes, we can pass on the power, pass on the baton to the young people to kind of decide what kind of a movement they would like to make, what are the important parts of this movement. And passing on the baton doesn't really mean that, okay, I'm just giving up everything and they will figure it themselves. It means to be also holding a support structure around them. So I think the picture that you see in the middle, that's the Blue Ribbons group, which is the youth-led group we are talking about. Sure, and we, all of us from the movement, are a central part of it, who are forming the movement, who are making it youth-led, who are making collective decision-making. But we are able to do what we are able to do because we have somebody who says, you know what, don't worry, we are standing with you and we are holding you and we are trusting you, and constantly kind of getting feedbacks, getting mentoring, and getting any kind of questions, any concerns, how to move forward, giving ideas, everything. But just that experience doesn't become decision. That experience comes as suggestions, as feedback, as thoughts, which then again this youth group kind of thrashes out to figure what's required. And the other part is elders who are listening and dialoguing with us. We've been also very grateful to have elders like John, Rajni, Mohan Bhai, who kind of in different ways share their experience and ideas. And because we could learn and talk with them, we've been able to kind of take these ideas in implementing it in PRF. Yeah, can we just stay at that slide? So in this part of, I just also wanted to go a little bit into the collective decision making part. What's happening is when we're saying young people need to lead, each of us is very different and has very different ideas and comes from a very different background and understanding. So this idea of collective decision making comes from Vinoba's ideas of saying that as if we have to evolve as a society, we need to build our collective consciousness, and that's only through collective decision making, because then all of us will move together. And this idea comes from a tribal village, Menda Lekha, where Mohan Hirabai has been one person who's guided and been with the village to kind of figure this journey to be able to also find out, claim forest right acts for them. And inspired from them, we said, how do we transfer this to an urban setting where we don't have a village where we stay together in the vicinity? We are all volunteers, we are all investing our extra time, but can we still hold these ideals together and design a movement which is able to go deep into understanding different nuances and brings change holistically? Because if we have to value diversity, inclusion is our first principle, and inclusion and non-violence can only bring together the collective decision making part. And once you have decided something collectively, you are as collective leaders also implementing it together. And I think this idea of leaderless movements, which we've been talking about, and different people have touched at different points. Yes, when we're saying leaderless movements, what we're saying is we don't have one leader who's centrally leading it or who's centrally taking it, but we have multiple leaders who are holding it. So we are not leaderless in that way. If we have to look at, we are leaderful, where each person in the movement becomes an individual or a leader in themselves, who's able to drive this, who's able to take this forward together. So when we are saying leaderless, we are not talking about making a vacuum and not being able to act and being stuck, but we're talking about being leaderful, where all of us are able to drive it together. I'm sure there will be times when we want to really have results, we want to have immediate action, and we may not really have the time when we just sit behind, discuss, and then come to a conclusion. And in that time, what we do is, can we just nominate a person and everybody just agrees that whatever this one person decides, we go with it, because right now we feel that person has the best expertise, and in the time we have, this person will be able to decide, and whatever this person decides, we go forward with it. And this comes from deep sense of trust, because without trust, we'll not be really able to take this forward. So collective decision making for us in our context where we're implementing has been able to build this trust, which brings in a pragmatism look of how do we hold things together, be in action, and alongside also hold the ideals and values in a manner that we are able to do something for the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Kejal. So apparently that bell thing was not working. So until now, so it kind of came back to life now. But I think you were reasonably close to the finish time we had. So Kejal, I I mean, for the non-Indians in the group, I should just mention that we have a very elastic concept of youth in India. So you could be a 70-year-old youth as well. And so we have, like, for example, the Youth Congress Party leader, which is kind of main political party. I don't know how it is. Tony's smiling in the Philippines, but we have a very elastic definition. So you could have like the president of the Indian Youth Congress in some state could be like 65 years old, because so that way it's a very open, flexible concept. But and I don't have any problems, Kejal, kind of accepting that we're a little bit out of date. You don't need to be very polite or kind of respectful beyond a point. I think there's a lot that we have to account for. Our group, we've kind of, the legacy we're leaving behind is not something that I'm proud of. So So I have no problems taking it on the chin. So thank you for your kind of kindness in the way you presented the failures of the previous generation. But more concretely, I think I'm just wanting to just check in with you on, because like in your in the work that you're doing in the Blue Ribbon Movement, do you only work with young people, or you work across ages in terms of the communities you work with, and how do you manage this? Because like if you're in a richer countries of the world, the distribution of the population is completely the opposite, right? Here in India, we have very few old people. Developing countries don't have much of an older population, which is why we are doing reasonably well on COVID, for example. But in a richer countries, you actually have a smaller proportion of young people. So how do you manage this, in terms of your groundwork?
Right. So while we are working in communities, a community are of course diverse set of people. The people we work with immediately, or the movement which is kind of deciding, thinking through, planning, they are the people who are young people, and they reach out to people of all ages. So we are going to be hosting an event on this Sunday where we are holding space for communities of all ages and of all types. So the community is not. So what we say is basically young people are the driving energy who are going to be holding the community together and bringing all sorts of people together. Because when you're talking about change, it's not just young people who bring the change. It's just that young people are able to have the energy and the effort to kind of conceptualize something that they will do alongside the entire community being a part of it.
Thank you, and I think we'll come back to this, Ian, when we move to your part of the presentation next. And because I'm very curious to know how you manage this question of leaderlessness, or as Kejal has put it, leaderfulness. That you actually don't have. It's not a question of not having leaders, but you have a lot of leaders. So then there's still a question as to how do you move forward with that. So my request is that we're kind of a little bit behind schedule, but we play the Ekta Parishad slideshow on their COVID work, and then we come to Ian, Tony, and Maji after the slideshow is over. So if people want to take a loo break or whatever, this is a good time for those who have to do it. But Ria, can I request whoever you guys, tech guys, to play? And just to mention for the people who are presenting questions, we are keeping track of it. Ria, etc. I'm getting the questions. That's partly why I'm trying to keep an eye on my phone. I'm getting them all on WhatsApp. Obviously, we can't take all the questions, but we're trying to make sure that we bring in. I'm asking some of the questions to the panelists as we go along. Some of those questions are coming from the audience. So thank you for your engagement, and keep it coming. Even if your question doesn't get answered now, we'll try and make sure that it goes to the panelists, and we try and do it afterwards as well. So please, tech folks, can you present the Ekta Parishad show?
So this is a compilation of some of Ekta Parishad's work during the COVID crisis. A lot of work has been done in rural areas to help with the migrant crisis along with the COVID crisis. So this is just a small slideshow of their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for that. By the way, I was just going to mention to the panelists that some of the questions on the chat, which are also directed specifically to Gustav or something, you feel free to answer that if you are able to multitask. And I was going to mention to Kejal that I was in a call just now before this, Kejal, on the talking about the old new mix, and one of the persons on the Zoom call wrote saying BRB something something, and I thought BRB is the name of somebody, so I was like saying, who's BRB? What did BRB say? And apparently BRB is what is it? Back soon or something.
Be right back.
Yeah, be right back. Yeah. So BRB is apparently be right back. For everybody in this panel who's over 40 years of age, BRB is be right back for future reference. I genuinely thought it was somebody who I didn't know was on the room or on the chat. So I was asking, who is this BRB person? So Ian, let's come to you. And for those of you who don't know Ian, it's very important that you get to know who he is. He is representing in this conversation the work that they're doing in the UK on climate and systemic change that they're trying to bring about there. I would say that the Extinction Rebellion is probably one of the most important kind of people's mobilizations that have happened in the last. I mean, I know it's happened over time, but it's really got a lot of visibility in the last year or two. And I certainly have it keeps popping into my screen from different angles, and I've been fascinated to understand how you managed to get this kind of traction. And so, Ian, I don't want to take more time, but please jump in, tell us about your work and the questions that we're trying to address today.
It's tricky, and where do you start? First, I think I need to acknowledge some privilege, that this is what maybe a forum on leadership should look like, not so many white faces. It's a shame there's not more women here. And I also acknowledge the privilege that I'm speaking in my first language. Other people I can see are working in second languages, possibly even third. So, I think primarily in the UK, our role is to listen and to learn. Extinction Rebellion has grown very, very fast, and that's created all sorts of problems and tensions. And a lot of what we've done is on the back of work previously done by other groups and other struggles which have been going on for sort of 500 years now, some of them. And I think it really beholds us to have some humility for that, particularly in the UK, because we live in a small island, and we've got all these privileges that have come to us essentially through colonialism. We've got so much to learn about previous struggles, and we have to kind of decolonize ourselves. When I started on this, I was just of the belief that the climate problem was the problem. As time's gone on, I've become educated and learned about how difficult it is for other people. This has led to the popular critique of exile, that it's predominantly white and middle class. It's saying, if anything, for me personally, it's raised more questions than it's answered at the moment. Things are emerging now. Are we a campaign or are we a movement? Are we just there to mass mobilise, or is there greater work to do, given the position that we've acquired? I'm certainly no leader. I'm not an academic or a public speaker, which is why I find this stuff quite difficult. Originally I was doing on the ground campaigning. We originally decided to have co-founders, 10 of us, so that there weren't people who were the specific focus or the leaders. But in practice, that has happened to a degree. We're working through that kind of debate. There's also, it then asks more questions, you know, if we really acknowledge the systemic nature of the problems that we face at this time, you know, are we anti-capitalist? Are we campaigning for degrowth? Or are we leaving it all to citizens' assemblies, which we've said we want? And how would those be constituted? So it asks a lot of questions. There's also the question of, you know, whether is what we're doing now actually prefigurative? There's a lot of tension in that some of the work we're doing around, you know, movement building. Is it fully prefigurative? We have this, what we call a regenerative culture, but in practice, we don't always live up to that. So it's, yeah, I'm quite stretched by it. And then it's been further compounded by the you know, the massive change in context that we've had with COVID and everything else. Previously, you know, people talked about strategy, and strategy to me involves fixing the context in which you operate. You know, you try and simplify your context you're in to, you know, make a plan that you can have going forwards. And it seems now that no plans are any good, because the context changes faster than the plans are out of date the minute they're made, or the strategies. And it's how do we respond to that, and what are the implications of that for theories of change that we're working with? Yeah, so it answers more. It asks more questions of me than it answers. The other aspect of Extinction Rebellion is the movement building, and because of the massive popularity and the speed of growth, I think there has been an element within XR of movement building which was taken to think that other people should come and join us. Whereas I think, given the length and nature and the experience of people who are struggling on the ground, you know, who essentially some kind of collapse is not a new thing for them. We need to go and ally with them, and that's certainly in the, you know, the western parts of XR is a big debate. It might be characterised by, we've got people who are carbon fundamentalists and think the problem is just atmospheric carbon, whereas is the real problem systemic injustice, and then what should be the focus of our campaigning? So I'm sorry I can't offer you many answers and any questions, but this is kind of the stage we're at in this process at the moment, or as I perceive it. You know, we rapidly need to sort of globalise our perspective. I think we do still have far too much of a kind of white perspective at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We're very kind of, I think, self-effacing and humble about what you've done, which I think is not reflective of the reality. I think you guys have done some amazing. I mean, leave alone the specificities of the, you know, the demands and the climate change issue, but in terms of mobilizing people in a serious way at the grassroots level in very large numbers in a very short span of time, yours is like a case study for all of us who study, you know, campaigns and mobilization. So, but my question was going to be that, you know, so do you see this? I mean, in fact, two questions. One is, do you have XRs now in so many different parts of the world, and how do you how's that part coordinated? I know that it's all spontaneous to an extent, so you don't need to bother about coordinating it, but is there more of a global feel to what Extinction Rebellion is doing, or then you tie up with other climate movements? So how does that work? That was one question. And the second thing is a question which came from the audience earlier was that, so the climate question is obviously quite complex in many ways. So do you kind of, because classically what we are told is, let's start from where the people are and kind of build on what they know and they understand. But here we don't have the luxury of waiting for everybody to understand everything and come along with us. So how do you balance this thing about, are you pulling people with you or you go at their speed? How does that work?
Again, this is an area that's really challenging. We, certainly in the UK, we had massive growth, but we had massive growth within one constituency, which was largely, middle class and educated people who'd suddenly got the nature and the depth of the crisis, and it was kind of new to them. But in reality, a lot of this crisis has been going on elsewhere in the world for a long time already. And if we don't, if we only do things that appeal to people from our existing set, we can't expand. And this is where the whole justice question is so important. If it's only based on carbon fundamentalism, it will only get a certain type of person on board. And the broader justice issues are more important, I think, because they essentially what drive the crisis that we're in. And if we don't address those, we can't expect people to ally with us who are already fighting those struggles. And that we can build no true mass movement or ally with others. There's a real tension there at the moment. White people are, privileged white people are not numerous enough or possibly motivated enough, because most of us are too comfortable to actually agitate for real change. And currently, I think some of what we do does alienate other people. The whole strategy of mass arrests and things works in the UK for white people, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody else, even people of colour in the UK. Never mind, in India, I've seen enough pictures of police with sticks immediately. My partner's from Sri Lanka, and the same. How does our current strategy, or how do our current tactics fit in those contexts? And I'm not sure it does.
How much is it multiplying in other places, Ian? And also, could you say something about what you meant by regenerative culture? What does that mean?
Regenerative culture was the idea from the outset that we were going to work in a way that wasn't self-destructive and that didn't reflect the existing paradigm, where at all points we try and prefigure in ourselves what we want to see. So we work. I'm very poor at explaining these ideas. Essentially, not to focus like the existing paradigm on just single focus on the problem. It was to focus more broadly on ourselves, what it does to us, how we relate to it. I'm making a mess even describing this. It's a lot of things I know intuitively rather than, I'm not an academic teacher.
Yeah. And did you want to say anything about how, do you have XRs now in many countries? How does it work?
Well, it is. It is, and I don't know how it's going to work going forwards, because I think, to some extent we're losing people at the moment because of the debates we're having. I'd like to understand more about how it would work in other contexts, but thus far, XR seems to be, from my perspective, siloed around the UK perspective.
No, it's good. So I think, Ian, one of the things which, hopefully is beneficial from this call is there's a lot of people here who've been thinking about all these issues for a long time. So do feel free to reach out. I mean, I'm not so sure as to how much our experience is relevant to what you're doing, but certainly I think we're more than happy to share our thinking with you. And I mean, but thank you for also being super honest about your dilemmas and your challenges. I think in some ways you've kind of become a victim of your own success. It's all happened so fast and it's become so big that it's kind of a challenge, but in a part of it is a happy problem to have, right? I mean, I think a lot of movements would like to be super successful and struggling with how to kind of cope with this. So thank you again. So let's go to Nigeria now. And so Maji, you're going to bring yourself on video. You're turning on your video, I hope, if you can. Excellent. So I want to just say one thing in terms of introducing. Maji's got this sort of small responsibility of representing a continent of how many 700 million people, Maji, and particularly kind of North and West Africa from where he's coming, and he's working a lot on peace, building, reconciliation, all of those challenging questions, and kind of connecting it to Dewi and those of us from India. So we have kind of an interesting situation. We didn't talk about this much until now, the whole question of faith and Islam, because Maji's in the middle of the whole Boko Haram challenge, and so Indonesia is the single largest Muslim country in the world. We in India have the dubious distinction of being the second largest Muslim country and systematically discriminating against the Muslims we have. And then you have the Boko Haram situation, which is a whole challenge in itself, because in our places, Islam is kind of the victim. And here you have a situation where Islam is seemingly the perpetrator of some of the problems that the society is facing. So you do weave that into the conversation. But I mean, the previous discussion we had, Maji had some really important things to say about leadership and leadership styles. And so over to Kaduna in Nigeria.
Thank you, Salil. It's really nice to be here and nice to see everybody again. It's always interesting that when a conversation involves me or anybody from my part of the world, Boko Haram always takes a shot at it. And it's interesting that it's not just because it's Boko Haram, it's because it has become a part of a global conversation. The issue of terrorism, counter-terrorism, preventing terrorism, and all of that. It's always a very good thing, and I hope we come to a place where everybody will realize that fighting against terrorism, countering terrorism, mitigating the issue of terrorism is supposed to be a global process, not a national action. It's very interesting to be here and to get to talk about the whole concept of leadership and looking at it in broader perspective. I'm glad about the people that spoke early. They have taken a long journey of looking at the concept of leadership, looking at leadership in political climate, leadership and social movement. And then Kejal was able to look at generational leadership. We've had a lot of people talk about different things and the spheres. And the truth is, leadership is not a straitjacket. Leadership means differently to different people depending on how they relate to the concept and how it impacts on them. So it is the impact, the effect, the connection we have with the leadership that actually influences a lot of things that we get to see. And the truth is, most of the time, when we're talking about the issue of leadership, a lot of people look at leadership because they are in the front burner, they are the ones in charge, so they see it as power. I'm in charge, I'm in control, I'm the person here who makes the decision, I'm the person that takes the lead. And that is the first problem we have about understanding leadership. Once we start looking at leadership from the perspective of power, it becomes challenging, especially for the other people who are at the back of the horizon, who are supposed to push the process. But it will be very helpful when we look at leadership from the perspective of responsibility. You have been given a position, not because they're giving you power to dominate, not because they're giving you power to control, not because they're giving you power to take charge, but because they're giving you responsibility to ensure that things work for the interest of many. But most of the time, what happens is we look at leadership from the perspective of power. And what that brings about is that people see leadership like a pyramid, not a circle. And whenever we look at leadership from the perspective of a pyramid, what we're looking at is power over. At the top of the pyramid, the little 1% or 0.1% are at the top of the pyramid, and then it keeps slanting down until it comes to where the all of us are. So it is power over us. And because leadership, from the perspective of a pyramid and power over, makes it difficult for people to connect with the process. Because when issues that concerns me, when issues that affect me, when policies that touches on me is going to be discussed, I want to recognize my voice in it. I want to recognize my interest. I want to recognize the truth that my constituency is taken care of. And that's why we have a lot of movements coming out. People talking about discrimination from the perspective of sexuality, discrimination from the perspective of faith, discrimination from the perspective of gender. All of this is because issues that concerns our constituency, we don't find our interest on the table. We don't find our voices on the table. We don't find opportunities that speak for our constituency. What do? We raise our voices. What people want in every space is visibility. It doesn't matter if we're the smallest part of the pie. It doesn't matter if we're the large chunk of the pie. It doesn't matter if we're just a quarter of the pie. What we want is visibility. Irrespective of how little you think I am I visible in policies and issues that concern me? Somebody raised the question of what has leadership and this movement got to do with people with disabilities? Is because they are not visible in our conversation. It's because we don't listen to them. And when we talk about a space, a social movement, nobody is silent. It's just that a lot of people are not being heard. And they are not being heard because we're looking at power over and not power with. Power with is what creates a platform for us to listen to what people are saying and for us to assess how does our policies impact them. And unless we bring out platform where people feel their voices can be heard and they're visible in decision making, we're going to always have issues. And that's why a lot of the younger people that we have realize that they are not feeling represented, they are not feeling recognized, they are not feeling as if they are part of the whole conversation. And that is what brings about the concept of the people power. The people power is not just a movement, it's an ideology. Where we are able to speak to those who think they are in charge and tell them, see, we employed you, you work for us because you are sitting on the mandate of our voices and the mandate of our choices. Sometimes we make mistakes in the choices we made because the picture we saw is not what it really is. But we can make a difference because of the entire movement of the people power. So how do we move forward? I always say the only way we can move forward, the only way we can succeed, the only way we can make achievement is when we come back to the issue of inclusive and participatory leadership. Where people realize that there is a platform that is created for them to be able to voice out. And social media has made that very easy. And a lot of leaders now are using different arms of the social media. It could be Twitter, it could be Instagram, whatever it is, to create a space where people could listen to them, where they could engage directly, people could talk. And people are able to raise up issues that concern them. And when we talk about inclusive and participatory leadership, that means it is possible for us to hold leadership accountable. It is possible for us to tell leaders, this is our contract with you. It means it is possible for us to tell leaders, these policies does not work for us. And for that to succeed, we must take away the concept of them against us, them versus us. And the challenge is leadership itself influences. And we've had a lot of people who are within the civil society space in Nigeria here that have ventured into politics. And a lot of the people within the civil society space came all out supporting and following them because we feel this is somebody who understands the crave of the masses, because he is somebody who's a grassroots person. But surprisingly, a lot of them get on the platform, on the parapet of power, and power influences them. And they actually didn't make the difference that we expect of them to make. So what are we talking about? We're talking about the concept that most of the time, when we're talking about inclusive leadership, we're creating a platform where everybody feels like my voice is found in issues that affect me. That means we create a platform where people could engage. We create a space where we could talk the truth to power. We create a space where what we call in Africa, Ubuntu. I am because you are because I am. One for all and all for one. If three communities are having issue of exclusion, if three communities are challenging the perspective of discrimination, if they feel they are not included, and today they include my community, it does not mean the other two has been included. I should not keep quiet. I should be part of the people's movement to say justice means fairness. And that's why we always have this issue. And like I always want to share with people, peace in the absence of justice is the institutionalization of oppression. And unless we create a movement where people's ideals, people's voices are found in the corridors of conversation that affects them, we're going to have an issue. And we should not allow this movement to die until we get to a space where we're all talking for the interest of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Maji. So, one of the things a question which has come up from the audience, and I want to kind of close with that, is that, because there was an issue about social movement leadership, thematic focus, campaign versus movement. But one of the questions which people have been asking is, should we not simply focus on political, accountability of political leaders, which I think is the last slide you kind of put on for us, Maji. So interestingly, if you look at the COVID situation, right? If you look at the countries, the 4 countries which are performing the worst in terms of COVID, whether infectivity or number of deaths, and you look at the leaders in these 4 countries, there's a pattern. So you look at, obviously Trump, who's the worst performing country in the world. Then you have Bolsonaro in Brazil. You have Putin in Russia. You have Modi in India. And you have the highest death rate in the UK with Boris Johnson. And if you take the African continent, Nigeria is struggling, and the numbers are only going to shoot up. Now, Buhari is obviously not quite in the kind of elected authoritarian category, but he is a bit dozy, right? And what he said and what he says and what he does, I guess most leaders are the same. So I wanted to just, ask you a quick question on that, Maji, before we play Liz's video, as to, how do you create accountability of elected leaders, and shouldn't that be our primary focus?
Yeah, that's the truth. And most of the time we think about political leadership. Political leadership takes the front burner because they are the interface between our interests as a country and the world. But the truth is that the entire movement rests on us who follows issues that have been said. There is a state in my country that I don't want to mention, and the cases of COVID infection was on the rise, and the leadership didn't want to shut down that state. But the people realized that it's our life that is at stake. They were following the professional protocol that was given. And one thing we should realize is that a lot of the political leaders don't think beyond self. And that is why there is politicization of policies when it's going to affect my credibility and acceptance. A lot of things that are happening in most of these nations you're saying is people are taking positions, people are being lackadaisical because, one, some of them, it's an election year. They're trying to do what they can that feel they are speaking the voice of a majority. Two, others are struggling for acceptance. Other people are fighting for legitimacy of government and institution. Others are struggling for legitimacy and acceptance of their self and their policies and the interests that the political party which they represent. And all of this comes to play against the interest of the masses. A lot of those leaders have made mistakes. Like a lot of people felt like, no, the UK shut down far too late. A lot of people are looking at the obvious politicization of the issues in the United States. A lot of people are looking at the carelessness that is happening in Brazil. And there are people that actually refuse. Like somebody said that, yeah, we have these cases because we are testing. I mean, like last month, somebody was asking a question to one African country, an African leader. He said, how comes you don't have any case of COVID-19? And he said, because we don't have the test kits. So if we're not testing anybody, how do we know we have cases? And they're not even making attempts to look for it. So I think the politicization is what is there. And people keep looking at it like a competition, like I have failed if too many people are dying, too many people are infected. So they're not even giving us real figures.
Thank you, Maji. So, as I said, I was going to save the best for last, and I juggled the order slightly, Tony, without your permission. But so, Tony, do come in. I mean, we have. I mean, what does one say about Duterte and the Philippines? It's like he seems to be really kind of. As I said, we seem to have a collection of some really interesting, super special leaders, and Duterte is clearly one of those in the world today. So, tell us how you're handling that reality and what do social movements mean in the Duterte Philippines?
Thank you. Well, 30 years ago, we brought down the Marcos dictatorship, and now it seems that we're going around in a full circle. We're coming back to that period. The land rights movement also got some very solid reforms, like a comprehensive agrarian reform program and a Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. When we were able to topple the dictatorship 30 years ago. What I'd like to share is the result of a kind of a reflection by farmer and indigenous peoples leaders and also civil society leaders on the past 30 years. What have you achieved and what are the key lessons of the past 30 years of agrarian reform and indigenous peoples land reform? I'd like to be brief and summarize the whole discussion in 6 major points. Maybe that will be about 1 minute per point. The first point is that when you get a victory like agrarian reform, like a law or a program from government, through a massive national social movement, once you achieve it, you have to address it until you have to keep addressing it until it is completed or until it's done. Like the agrarian reform program was supposed to end in 20 years, in 10 years. But now it's 30 years already, we haven't finished. We have gone through 5 presidents. But because the civil society groups and the social movement were there, it was kind of a love-hate relationship. We would use both the hard and the soft approach in trying to push every single bit of information or every law, every letter of instruction, argue and also work all the way from the top to the local communities. So in the past 30 years, we've been able to transfer land to about 5.5 million families. because of that work of 30 years for farmers and indigenous peoples. And the collective area covers about 12 million hectares. And this covers about almost 40% of the entire country. But most of this still remains in the form of titles or deeds or permits and all of that, which continues to be contested. Um, and despite the reforms, you still have a lot of conflict and you still have a lot of poverty. And therefore, the need may be for us to get into more and more peace work and negotiation work. In fact, when we did an analysis of the major land conflicts in the Philippines 2 years ago, we found out a disturbing trend that about 30% of the um, of the emerging conflicts, land conflicts, were between communities, were between poor communities of people fighting for the same piece of land, like between farmers and indigenous peoples. And therefore,
we've lost you, Tony. Are you there? Ria, could you check, please?
Tony, you've frozen. Your internet seems to have a problem. Can you try resetting your system, or maybe turn off your video? It might help.
That's a shame. I mean, Tony waited the whole time. He's the last speaker, and now he can't come online. So I hope it works.
We'll try to get him back in.
Okay. Should we play the video? If you feel that it's going to take a bit of time to get Tony back, do we want to start on Liz's video?
We can. I think Tony.
He's back. He's back. Yeah. Okay, very good. Excellent. Tony, you're back. You can hear us. Sorry, we just lost you briefly.
Yeah. Sorry, there's very, very heavy rains here right now, so the internet is fluctuating. I was on my second point.
So, Tony, if you want to turn your video off, feel free to do that if that helps.
Okay, thank you. So, what we have now are that political work continues, but in a different form, in the form of continued organizing. But a lot of things that have, one of the approaches that has really grown is the development of farmer paralegals. Because instead of one big energy, you now have work that has been diffused to address thousands and hundreds of thousands of individual small land cases. And so, therefore, the approach also had to change. We are also a reduced political force. It's difficult now to organize around agrarian reform. Before we could bring in about 1,000 people, but now bringing a few hundred already takes a lot of effort. Many of the organized farmer groups have lost their activism after gaining their land. We also have an aging farmer population. The average age is 55, and maybe also aging activists. Also among the youth, my third point is that among the youth, it has been difficult to organize around agrarian reform. It is losing its appeal because when you say agrarian reform, they say it's a program of the government. And the youth are more interested, it seems, I don't know, but they say that they're more interested in seeing specific action where they can see immediate results. And yet, land rights is long-term and the gains are not tangible. This generation has also begun to lose its rural and agricultural roots. Like, for example, my father was a farmer, but my children don't have any links anymore to the rural areas. people were no longer interested after maybe also it's a burnout of in terms of the protest culture or the old system of the protest culture. My fourth point. It's not to say that the land movement has dissipated. No. What I'm saying is that it has shifted its energies towards other, more focused campaigns and more pressing issues because the battleground right now in the land rights movement are the uplands and the indigenous people's lands. And therefore, there's a rise of two types of coalitions in the Philippines. One is the anti-mining coalition, which threatens the ancestral domains. 75% of the biodiversity areas or the conservation areas of the Philippines lies in the indigenous people's lands. And therefore, this becomes a very strong, compelling argument for environmental activists to also work for indigenous people's rights to land and self-governance. So now you can see a blending of the different movements. The second one is the rise of local environmental coalitions. The Philippines is an archipelago of 7,000 islands, and each island is a fragile ecosystem in itself. And therefore, an impact of one disaster like a mine tailing or a typhoon can have very long-lasting effects because of the very fragile ecosystem. And the increasing impact of natural disasters, also brought out by climate change, have brought about greater public awareness on the connectivity of communities in a landscape, including between urban and cities and rural areas. Because by the structure of islands, the cities are in the shore and the farmers are in the island. Yes. And so in some areas like northern Mindanao, where I also work, there is now a payment for environmental services scheme whereby businesses and organizations from the urban community provide financial incentives for the tribal communities in the mountains to lead in some of the reforestation efforts. And in turn, this strengthens their claim on the land and threats and strengthens and gives them confidence that of their ownership. Number 5, just two more. Number 5. The fifth is that we have gained a lot of grassroots representation in many government policy bodies. But now, because of the law and the laws and the different reforms, but we have begun to question how effective the arrangements have been over time when interest has waned, and also how effectively we have used them, and how responsible also our even grassroots leaders have been in terms of reporting back decisions to communities. Finally, let me just say that we have not been able to assert ourselves as an electoral political force. There is no farmers' vote, there is no women's vote, and we don't know whether that is okay or not. No? Because our problem is this, like President Duterte. President Duterte remains enormously popular even among our civil society groups, but more strongly among our grassroots organizations. Yet over the past 4 years, we have experienced a return to extrajudicial killings, the jailing of opposition leaders, while we were under quarantine, under lockdown right now, there was a closure of the largest TV and radio broadcast station. the jailing of a top journalist, and just yesterday, the president signed a new anti-terror law, which will allow government to detain suspects for 24 days without charges. This is unprecedented. This is really unprecedented. If you give me a little more time, I'll go. There are 4 more points.
So, Tony, I'll be in trouble if you take too much longer. But please finish your kind of main point. Really, if you want to kind of summarize the 4 points into 1 or 2 key points, please do.
But just a question about what are the challenges in terms of leadership in social movements, especially in dealing with land rights, looking at where we are right now. One, community organizing still remains as the core of the social movement's work. And this is working with the poor. That's still the core of the work. Two, the need for specific skills to strengthen negotiations, both with government but also with each other in terms of mediation. Third is the need for communication skills and being seen and heard. And fourth is getting the youth involved. And maybe just a last point in ending, I will just say that for the youth who are listening here, and this was mentioned to me also by some of the youth, they were saying, we are living in a time of very high uncertainty, which our children will inherit. What are these? A pandemic, which will continue on for this generation, a changing climate, and increasing national debt, which our children will have to pay in taxes. And therefore, I end with a quote for my mentor, Dr. Umali, who said, my generation has failed your generation. And you should rise to be the leaders and the heroes that we never were. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That's a good way to hold us all accountable, all the oldies in this panel. The last thing we want to do is to listen to Liz Theoharis' presentation, and we will do that. And my suggestion to Ria and the organizers is, because I think Tony's done a good job of kind of touching on all the aspects. I'm not going to try to summarize, and it's impossible to summarize a discussion like this. I think the purpose of the session was to inform, and most of the listeners and audience is younger people, so inform and kind of bring to their attention some of the historical perspectives, some of the current challenges, but also to inspire. And I hope the panel has been inspiring and to provoke thinking. So I hope we've kind of succeeded in doing some of that, to the extent that it's possible in these virtual Zoom type Zoominars. So within those constraints, I hope we've done what we can. And my suggestion to Ria and the group is that we close with playing Liz Theoharis' video, and that we don't actually come back and again reopen the discussion after that, because we're already running behind schedule. It's a 7-minute or so video. So Liz, just to kind of mention to you that Liz is the co-convener or co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. You may know William Barber II is the other co-convener, and they're all in the kind of heart of the Black Lives Matters movement right now. And interestingly, she's a Presbyterian minister, so the whole issue of the role of faith, and Ian didn't mention his Quaker kind of roots and origins in some ways, but I mean, so the whole issue of faith, philosophy, and values in everything we do, I think is something which Liz's video will bring out as well. So let me, from my side, thank all our amazing panelists from all over the world. Ian, we didn't have too many white men in this panel. Actually, if you look at it, we did quite well, and we managed to muster some women and younger women as well, which I'm very pleased about. So thank you again to the audience. Thank you to all the panelists, and over to Jay and others to play Liz's video. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll play the video and then just go into the cultural performance, which was supposed to start at 3 o'clock. So I'm sorry to the people,
Thank you.
You might have been waiting for that. Sorry. Yes.
Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, and I'm the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the director of the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. I'm so pleased to be with you all today and be in support of Jai Jagat, because our world, and including the United States, desperately needs a grassroots movement from the ground up. In the United States, there are 140 million people who are poor and low income. That's almost half of the US population. 250,000 people die in the US every year from poverty and inequality. That's 700 people dying a day. There are 62 million people who work jobs that pay less than a living wage, 15 million families who can't afford their water. There are about 80 million families without adequate health care insurance in a time of pandemic and social health care crises. And I could keep on going. I could tell stories of the grassroots leaders in Lowndes County, Alabama, who are living with raw sewage in their yards, and the undocumented families in California who are organizing for their lives and their housing. I can tell you about how coal miners in Kentucky are linking up with moms in the Mississippi Delta and building a movement from the ground up to change this society. I've been involved in grassroots organizing for about 25 years of my life, when I got involved first with the National Union of the Homeless and the National Welfare Rights Union, two different national organizations of poor, of homeless, of low-income people who are fighting to make this country and this world better. And for those past 25 years, we've been trying to dedicate ourselves to building a movement, because we believe that movements begin with the telling of untold stories and only happen when those who are most impacted by injustice, by racism, by poverty, and by all forms of inequality and despair build a movement from the ground up that can actually eradicate, can actually address, can actually overcome all of the social ills. In the United States right now, there are thousands of people who have joined a movement of actually millions who are every day waking up and thinking about, how do we build a movement? How do we learn from leaders in the past and come together across all of our differences, all of our distances? How do we connect people from different races, different religions, into a powerful movement for change? In 1967, the year before Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, he called for poor people of all races in the United States building a Poor People's Campaign. He said the dispossessed of this nation, the poor, live in a cruelly unjust society. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And then from there, Dr. King called for people to come together across issues of racism, poverty, and militarism to build a movement from below. Well, more than 50 years later, grassroots leaders in the United States are building and conceiving, reviving a new Poor People's Campaign for today. We call it the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. In 2018, we organized the largest and most expansive wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in 21st century America. And just a couple weeks ago, we organized the largest social media gathering of poor people in United States history. Millions of folks tuned in, turned out to be a part of a mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington. We put forward some bold and visionary demands demands like health care for all, education for all, living wage jobs for all, adequate income for all, an end to racism, a promotion of voting rights, a promotion of environmental protections and immigrant rights, and so many more things that are needed for a just society and that are within reach. In the United States, we throw out more food than it takes to feed every person, and yet we have kids in more than half of our homes who are struggling to have enough food. In the United States, we have more abandoned luxury housing units than there are homeless people, and yet we have the highest levels of homelessness, including among children, than we have ever had in U.S. history. It is time now for us to link up with others all across the world and build a massive movement to raise up people's lives. We have a saying in our work, which is, when you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Well, we are doing just that, and we're linking up with others who are building a movement of many for this moment. Thanks for being in touch. Please join us with the Poor People's Campaign in the United States and keep on building your work so we can indeed imagine and build a world where nobody goes hungry, where nobody's discriminated against, and where everybody has a right to live. Thank you.